Yes guys, I'm currently in Lichfield and this video is about a guy called Tom Neeld. No it's not, it's about a guy called John Neeld. Anyway, first of all I want to apologise for not being able to pronounce the name Tregontha. I don't know mate. Secondly, I wanted to get a shot of this Tregontha, so what I'm going to do is get it now. It's currently 7:15, 7:15 on Friday afternoon. I'm hoping this video is going to be out for around 8:30, possibly a little bit longer. Anyway, first shot's going to look cack because I've not got my selfie stick, so it means me hanging my arm out the car. Anyway, let's get into it guys. Oh, 19,000 followers as well. Go on the lads and lasses. In October of 1895, Lichfield was still living in the shadows of the Orgreave murders. A case that had already shocked the city and left its mark on the villages and lanes between Lichfield, Fradley and Orgreave. But while the story was still fresh in people's minds, another tragedy unfolded nearby, and this time it wasn't a murder, but the death of a well-known Lichfield tradesman whose final walk took him out of the city and towards the very landscape that people were already speaking about with fear and unease. His name was John Neeld, and he was not some unknown figure passing through the area. He was a local man connected with Bird Street in Lichfield, where he'd carried on business for many years as a painter, plumber and glazier. In a later newspaper report connected to the family, he was also described as a former Lichfield builder. But the reports from the time of his death gave the clearest picture of his working life, placing him in a world of practical trades, local customers and reputation. The kind of daily contact that would have made his name familiar to many people in the city. By the time of his death, Neeld was 53 years old, and the reports suggest a man who had once held a respectable position, but whose life had become unsettled in recent years. He'd lived at his house in Bird Street for around 27 years, and although there'd been talk of him moving to another house in Dam Street, the inquest made it clear that the thought of leaving his old home had troubled him deeply. According to those who knew him, his business had not been as good as it once had been, and at some point he even considered leaving Lichfield altogether with negotiations for a business in London. But old connections and family ties seemed to have proved too strong, and the plan was given up. There was also something else in his past that the inquest returned to again and again, because several years before his death, John Neeld had been involved in a trap accident. Witnesses remember him being thrown out, and his daughter, who had been a hospital nurse at the time, said that a doctor had told her that he was suffering from concussion of the brain. She said he'd been delirious for some time, and others who knew him said he'd never quite been the same man afterwards. In the language of the time, the newspapers described him as eccentric, excitable and strange in his manner. But when you read the inquest closely, what comes through is not just excitability, but a family and a community trying to explain the change in a man they'd known for years. On the Monday morning before his death, a gardener named James Barson saw Neeld walking along the path by Tregontha, at the back of Overstow, heading in the direction of what was once called Stow Church. Barson knew him and he called out, "Good morning, Mr. Neeld," but Neeld gave no reply and passed by without noticing him. And that small detail stood out to Barson because he'd known him for about 8 years and he was used to speaking with him. And as Neeld walked on, Barson thought he looked more depressed than he'd ever seen him before. In today's world, it's absolutely baffling they let him walk on. And I hope you guys listening know that you can always shout me up whenever you need. From there, it appears Neeld continued out of Lichfield, walking roughly 5 miles towards Fulbrooke, near the Kerbra sewer farm and close to the scene of the recent Orgreave murders. The reports say he was goaded by some strange impulse, and although that's the language of the newspaper rather than something anyone could truly know, what can be said is that he made his way into Nutwood, right near Fulbrooke, a secluded spot near Fradley, and there, between 2 trees, he ended his life. The discovery was made late that afternoon, sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock, by 2 boys from Lichfield named James Gilliver and William Barker, who had gone out together to get blackberries. They'd just finished picking in one place and they were looking around for another, when Barker climbed or looked up into a tree and saw what he first thought was a man's face. He called to Gilliver, and when they looked more closely they realised it was not someone standing there, but a man hanging between the trees. The reports describe the scene in blunt Victorian language, and it's difficult to soften it without losing the reality of what those boys found. John Neeld was hanging from a rope fastened to a branch of a tree, with his feet down in the brook beneath him, just above his boots. The newspapers said he'd clearly been dead for some time, and described his face as having a terrible appearance. was, with his eyes and tongue protruding, and flies already covering him. Barker was so alarmed by the sight that he ran away, while Gilliver, showing more courage, looked carefully and recognised the body as John Neeld. The boys first went to a nearby cottage and told an old woman what they'd seen. She went with them towards the place, but would not go too near, and they then fetched Mr. Mann from the corporation sewage farm. Mann went to the spot with Gilliver, and once he'd seen the body, they first went to Orgreave to find the police. But the constable there happened to be at Burton. They then went to Street Hay, where they found Constable Harrell, who returned with them to Fulbrooke and helped cut down the body. Get your head around this next bit, guys. There was some discussion at the inquest about why the body had not been cut down earlier, and whether there would have been any objection to someone doing that before the police arrived. The coroner said certainly not, because the man might not have been dead, but the explanation given was that from the position in which Neeld was hanging, the body would have fallen into the brook if cut down without care, and Mr. Mann believed it was better to leave everything exactly as it was until the police arrived. The coroner then accepted the explanation as satisfactory. The body was removed to the Swan Inn at Fradley Junction, where the inquest was held on the Wednesday afternoon before Mr. W. Morgan. John Neild's widow was present, but the coroner decided it would be too distressing to call her as a witness, and said that he didn't think it was necessary. Instead, the body was identified by Neild's brother-in-law, Herbert Larkin, a tobacconist who described him as a painter and decorator. Now, Larkin told the inquest that Neeld had lately been in his usual health, but that he had been worried about giving up his business and changing his residence. He said that he didn't think Neeld liked the thought of doing that. He also said that he'd never known Neeld threaten or attempt to take his own life. There was mention of a blotting pad that was seen a month earlier, which appeared to contain the impression of a letter that Neeld had been writing, and on it were the words, "My mind is unhinged," but Larkin said that he couldn't make out the address, nor much else beyond a word or two, and that he didn't believe it was a suicide threat. Others spoke about how Neeld had changed after the trap accident. Charles Connell, a sergeant major and foreman of the jury, said that he'd known him long enough and remembered the accident well. In his view, Neeld had never been the same man since, and at times it had been very strange. His married daughter, who was present at the inquest, also said that her father had never recovered from that accident, and explained that his behaviour in later years had become inconsistent. She said he'd sometimes go upstairs for hours to read the Bible and then come down very cross, and that small things had begun to irritate and worry him. There was something deeply sad in the way the family's evidence came across, because they were not trying to blacken his name or turn him into a spectacle. They were trying to make sense of a death that to them seemed almost impossible. One witness said he thought John Neeld was the last person on earth to do such a thing, and yet the signs had been there in small ways. The depression, the strange manner, the worry over his own, and the lingering effects of an injury that Victorian medicine couldn't heal. When Police Constable Harrell gave evidence, he said that in Neild's clothing were found 2 keys, a small case, 2 business letters and a circular. There was nothing connected with his death, no clear explanation left behind, and no final note to make sense of what had happened. Now that absence matters because so much of the story is built around people trying to understand his state of mind from the outside, piecing together his final days through fragments of behaviour, conversations and memories. The jury only took a few minutes to reach the decision, and their verdict was that John Neeld had committed suicide while in the state of temporary insanity. His funeral took place in Lichfield the following day, with newspapers saying there were signs of respect and sympathy for the family. That detail feels important because beneath the shocking headline and the grim description of the discovery, this was also the death of a father, a husband and a man whose family had deep connections in respectable circles. His eldest daughter Emily had married Dr. Peter Tytler of Cheetham Hill in Manchester. They married at St Mary's in Lichfield in 1889, and his eldest son, also named John Neeld, would later go on to a successful life in London as a wholesale mantle manufacturer. So the story of John Neeld is not simply the story of a man found dead near Fradley, and it's not just a strange footnote to the Orgreave murders. It's the story of a Lichfield tradesman whose life seems to have narrowed under the weight of business worries, domestic change and the possible after effects of a serious head injury. Until one Monday in 1895 he walked out of the city, past familiar paths and towards Fulbrooke, into a place already shadowed by recent violence. And perhaps that's why the story struck people so strongly at the time. The people of Lichfield had already been talking about murder, death and fear. and even suspicion in that direction. And then suddenly another familiar name was tied to the same landscape. Not as a victim of another person, but as a man whose mind had seemingly turned against him, leaving his family and his city to ask the same painful question that still sits behind the article now. What led John Neeld to take his final war?